game, and this was the weekend where you could take off. You didn't have to pay attention to anything going on in the world of college football. Not any marquee matchups, no chance of there being an upset here or there. Well, good thing I don't listen to those type of people, and good thing neither do you, because if we just witnessed history made, and all the wrong reasons, in the SEC. Welcome on into the SEC Unfiltered post-game show. I'm Cole Thompson, riding with you solo tonight, breaking down everything that we saw in Fayetteville as Arkansas pulls off yet another upset, 19-14 over the number 4 Tennessee Volunteers. Real quickly, make sure you hit that subscribe button down below because we're breaking down everything that we saw at RHOBACK Stadium. And also, we're going to do a lot of live reactions, post-game shows, Sunday Fun Day, Dave Calls Ball, everything and anything in between. Make sure that you hit that reaction button. Make sure that you hit that subscribe button down below. Make sure that also you're following us on the social channels, TikTok, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, at SEC Unfiltered. Follow me if you want the back and forth banner to continue, at Mr. Cole Thompson. Download the podcast version of the show and check out all of our great work found at SECUnfiltered.com. This episode is brought to you by our friends over at PrizePicks. Go to prizepicks.com and use the promo code SECU at sign up for an instant $50 play with your first purchase when you use that $5 plus lineup. You don't have to worry about making bets when it comes to your overall team. You go ahead and pick the plays, pick the players, hit the overs, the unders. Make sure that you walk away a winner, and PrizePicks is going to give you $50 with your first $5 lineup. Simply just use the promo code SECU at prizepicks.com and start playing today. Nobody was playing around in Fayetteville today because they realized and understood this was the game of all games. The Super Bowl, in a sense, for Sam Pittman after what we saw the last few weeks. Arkansas, team proven time and time again that they actually do look like a competitive roster. Things are not as bad as they seem. The dark and gloomy cloud that has resided over the program for the last several years is not as bad as it really looks from the outside in. And of course, you have Tennessee coming on into this game, now feeling riding high because they just marched on into a road atmosphere in Norman, a very hostile environment that eventually seemed to actually bode well in their favor. Nico Iamaleava was able to ball out, even though he had 2 turnovers early on in the game, and the defense stepped up. Sometimes just weird things happen in college football that nobody can explain. And today, of all days, was that moment. For those of you that don't know, this is the first time in SEC history that 2 top 5 teams in a conference have lost to unranked opponents. Sometimes just weird things happen in the sport. But let's go ahead and talk about the winners as we always do on this show first. Arkansas had to kind of treat this game like it was a one-season showcase. You know how we talk about teams like Alabama when they play against Georgia, or when you talk about a team like Ohio State when they take on Michigan? It is not a care in the world by the fan base, by those the boosters, those in control about what happened during the regular season. They don't care if they found a way to keep things close in a Michigan State matchup or against a Mississippi State. They care about that game. They care about how much you hate them and how much that you hate each other. They want to come out on top, and they want to watch you squirm in the process. That's always been the case. That had to be Arkansas's mindset going into this game. There is a real scenario where Arkansas woke up on Saturday morning sitting at 5-0. Seriously, they're sitting at 3-2. But honestly, when you look back at the game against Oklahoma State, still no idea how they lost that one when they outgained them by nearly 300 yards. And then you go back and you look at where this team was a week ago in Arlington, and you kind of say to yourself, well, it's Arlington. It's the Southwest Classic. Weird things go down whenever we travel to the Lone Star State and have to take on the Aggies. It's just common sense. But honestly, once again, you still see this team, and they kind of feel like, once again, a 5-0 roster on paper. But that's not how the game works. And when you sit at 3-3 versus sitting at 4-2, a little bit different of a scenario. So this had to be the game of all games, the one where you wake up. The one where you realize you're not going to shoot yourself in the foot, because the pieces are there. Go back and look at how Arkansas performed this week. Look at how Arkansas kind of set the tone in multiple other matchups. They were going to always deliver a performance if they could just stop finding ways to shoot themselves in the foot. The way they did against Oklahoma State on the road in Stillwater, the way they did last week in Arlington whenever they had to take on Texas A&M. It's just something about Arkansas. They find a way to fumble the bag at the 1-yard line and just push someone over the edge. That couldn't be the case. And for Tennessee, here's the problem. Tennessee fans walked into this game feeling mighty confident because they were coming off a bye. They just played an extremely physical, yet also pretty dominant game against Oklahoma. And they had the quarterback right. Nico Iamaleava had been delivering, and more importantly, the running game had been stepping up. Plus, you had a defense that was finally matching your aura on the offensive side of the football. This felt like 1998 was on the horizon. Now, here's the deal. Sometimes it's a bad thing to put the wagon before the horse. Don't believe me? Well, people were talking about down in Tuscaloosa last week, what happens when we have to go play against Tennessee. And we can get our revenge for 2022. Unfortunately, they forgot to take into consideration that the school, literally a little bit more westbound, was about ready to tear down their goalposts in the same state. That's what happened on Saturday down in Nashville. And so you heard some people around the Tennessee program saying, well, now we feel good about that Alabama game. What if we go play Alabama up to a certain standard? What if we are able to do what we did against Oklahoma and Alabama? And there were many people in this industry that said, hey, slow your roll, Tennessee. You still got to go ahead and play against Arkansas. And then you got to go play against Florida. Wouldn't it be funny if Florida, the team that has found a way to keep things really interesting with you over the last decade, just decided to add a bit more fuel to the fire before you took on the third Saturday in October? Well, instead it was Arkansas, and it was on the road. And this was one of those games where they woke up and chose violence. It was more than just a simple one-and-done type of performance from Arkansas on the ground. You saw this team kind of take things into their own hands. They put down all of the miscues, all of the information, all of the tripes and tribulations about how this team could look. And they just said, nope, we're going to play 60 minutes of spit swap and football to where we know that we're going to be better than advertised. And they did. Physically up front, the ability to be able to make play after play after play on the ground. Just go back to that opening drive, if you will, for a second. This was a game where they took 9 minutes and 17 seconds off of the clock. 9 minutes and 17 seconds off of the clock for a 3-point success. That was it. And then afterwards, they said, you know what? This is a formula that's kind of working. We're going to bring the fight to what we believe is going to be a bloodbath. We're going to bring the power to the ground game. And they did. And it started off with Quentin Jackson, who ended up rushing for about 57 yards and into the end zone. And then Braylon Russell, 7.6 yards, 2 gains of over 20-plus yards down the field, and they kept momentum. That was kind of the case. That was kind of the moment. This was a game that they needed to have. This was a game they did have. The other thing is that you kind of knew that Arkansas could have this type of performance in them, that they've shown you before. Look back at the first half of what was that Oklahoma State game. Look at how they looked at times against Texas A&M. When they weren't shooting themselves in the foot and when they weren't finding ways to fumble the bag, they actually looked like a coherent offense. But we do realize that this is an offense that has been at times and still continues to be at times a roller coaster filled with anxiety and heart attacks just waiting on the horizon. That's what you had at your disposal. Taylon Green, he is an emotional roller coaster of just you have no idea what to expect that week. And what you expected was him to deliver. And he did. He 100% did. No questions asked about it. 19 of 27, 266 yards at 9.9 yards per play. And he set the tone very early on. Isaac Zatenga stepping on up with a 23-yard gain. Luke Haas stepping on up for 16-yard gain. They were delivering on all cylinders. Andrew Armstrong with over 132 yards on the night. 3 catches of 20-plus yards down the field. Finally, this Tennessee secondary that people have been complaining about not being tested all year was tested. And for the most part, they were able to keep them out of the end zone, but they did keep things close and interesting. This was finally what you want to see if you were a guy like Tim Banks. Where was supposed to be the chinks in the armor? Where were the flaws? Because when you take on an Alabama, who now that game has just gotten even more interesting, you want to make sure that you were built on all 3 cylinders. Offense, defense, special teams. Where are the cracks in the armor? Where is the barrier that is eventually going to have one of those moments to where potentially you could see everything come in from the gorge and just flood and ruin your season overnight? That's what you want to figure out. And you did. You figured out what could be the weak point. A physical ground game and the ability to extend plays outside the pocket, that became a weakness. Now let's talk about Tennessee, for instance. Their secondary was tested. Their defensive front was tested. Nico also was put in a very tricky situation because the last thing that you want to do with a young quarterback traveling on the road coming off a bye when everyone was hyping him up was have to try and win a game by himself. Well, by the time that you got to the fourth quarter, the only way that you were going to be able to establish any type of dominance was through the air. And this was one of those performances where naturally, you had more than just him struggling. In fact, Nico, for my money, wasn't the problem in the slightest. 17-29, 158 passing yards, but also how many of those were drops? How many times did you watch as a physical defensive back like Slaughter come on up and break out a play? Like how about somebody in coverage for Arkansas on the outside? Travis Williams once again dialed up a formation that kept things really interesting. Found ways to put pressure on Squirrel White, on Chris Brazzell, on Dante Thornton, on the tight ends, take them out of the pocket and force Nico have to deliver clean, quick strikes. There is a scenario right now where the way that the defense has played against against Auburn, against UAB, in the first half against Oklahoma State, at times against Texas A&M, where they're sitting at 6-0. And here we are talking about Arkansas of all teams, finding a way to be the best in the SEC. Because I'm not sure if you guys would know this, they would be sitting at 3-0 and leading the conference. Texas A&M has that title right now. Texas A&M currently is leading the SEC in terms of wins. That could be Arkansas. Very well could. This was a program that could deliver. And naturally, because of Nico coming off a bye, what this defense was going to look like, could they carry that momentum after leaving Norman? Was that going to be the case? Unfortunately, it wasn't. Now, here is the good news for both these programs moving forward. And real quickly, make sure that you get your comments down in the section. We're going to break down everything that you have to talk about. We're here for the next 30 minutes if you really want to, so we can talk about everything that went wrong in week 6 before we do Sunday Funday tomorrow morning. But for both these teams, so much still is on the horizon. Now, I don't know what you're going to do if you're Arkansas. Definitely not going to be a college football playoff team unless you're able to find a way to get every win moving forward. Let's just look at the schedule because you have to realize that there are still some trap games. LSU after the bye, at Mississippi State, Ole Miss, Texas, Louisiana Tech, at Mizzou. Now, here's the good news. Every one of those games feels winnable at this point. Doesn't mean you will, but every single one of those games can be. You're going to be fresh. You're going to be cool. You're going to be calm. You're going to be collected. You're going to be easily back and feeling yourself when you have to play against the 13th ranked LSU, who's going to be playing a physical game against Ole Miss the next week. Texas, I can tell you this right now, many of fine folk on the 40 acres are not excited to make the trip up to Fayetteville. They've made it abundantly clear on social media. They've talked about it on radio. They've talked about it wherever they've been. That is the one game that they have circled on the calendar that they are just begging does not end up coming back to bite them in the keister. So they know what type of game they're going to face when they take on Arkansas. Ole Miss, what version are we getting? We going to see the one that went into Cola today and then dismantled that Gamecock team that found a way to beat up on Kentucky, who once again found a way to beat up on Ole Miss, their backyard? Or are we going to see the one that actually struggled at times to find any offensive identity, and it's going to look very iridescent to what we saw on Saturday when Tennessee came rolling into town? What's that going to be like? Because that's also a home game. What about Mizzou, end of the year? That's not a top 15 team. The way that they've looked the last 3 weeks, if somebody called them exposed, they are 100% in their right. I can't blame them. I don't think anybody can, nor do I think anybody can. So Arkansas at this point still has the best ahead of them. And I think for 8-4, that might be good enough for many people to feel like there is traction in the right direction. Also, can we just give a huge shout out to this team on how they rallied once they lose Taylon Green? Guy is the heart and anchor and really at times also the main X factor for this offense to hum. And Malachi Singleton comes on in and doesn't miss a beat before running it in for an 11-yard score, finding a way to put himself on top. And everyone, I think, realized that that team was doing it not just for Pittman, not just for Taylon Green. They were doing it for the pride of Fayetteville, who have been waiting to see what these type of upsets can look like. Because Arkansas wants to get back to that level of consistency that they had when Bobby Petrino was on the sidelines. 2012 came, and unfortunately, a Harley-Davidson ruined it. That was what we saw moving forward. Top 5 finish at the end of 2011. Everything went off the rails once you saw Bobby Petrino kind of hightail it out of there and they turned to John L. Smith in 2012. They want to get back to this level, and they can. They 100% can. Especially now when you look at what they have with the ground game, now when you look at what they have with the passing attack, how their defense has looked at times, they can be that team. Now let's also talk about this. There were multiple moments where the aggressiveness nearly came back to bite them in the ass. 2 fourth down failed attempts. Imagine if this game ends up being 14-13 and they end up actually seeing themselves, well, hindsight was 2020. Maybe we didn't need those points. Maybe this game is so far out of reach that fans are not holding on to the railing at Razorback Stadium before charging the field because if they know that the upset is already on the midst. Nothing else is even going to be in their horizon, in their landscape. They just got it done. You can feel that way. And again, did end up biting you this week. Maybe it will in the future. Maybe it will when Texas comes to town. Maybe it will when you take on LSU. But still, when you have that offense, when you have the ability to go for it on fourth down, you also are paying for the consequences of potentially missing on that. And that may end up being the difference between a win and a loss. That's what you saw. Now let's talk about what we see from Tennessee moving forward. Here's the good news. If you're Tennessee, you kind of just control your destiny at this point. You have a win over Oklahoma on the road. You also have a marquee win over NC State, which, yes, at this point, I know that NC State has started to lose a little bit of steam, has started to lose a little bit of traction. I'm not going to judge them. I'm not, because it's still a win against a P5 opponent in a neutral site location. That carries a little bit of weight. It does. Tennessee also has a win on the road against Oklahoma, and they still have matchups ahead to where they get to control their own destiny. They got to play Florida. They get to play Alabama. They get to play Kentucky. They get to play Georgia. Vanderbilt at the end of the year, which now feels like a marquee matchup of all marquee matchups. They play against enough quality teams to where their resume will speak volume, but more importantly, they can get right. And Alabama has a loss. And Georgia has a loss. And Ole Miss has a loss. And Missouri has a loss. And Texas, depending on what happens when they play Oklahoma next week, when they play against Georgia, they could have a loss. So everyone in the SEC at this point that is entering that conversation to be quote-unquote contenders has at least one loss. This is not a death sentence for a team like Tennessee, not even in the slightest. And they still have a young quarterback that's going to learn from this mistake, put himself back in a better position, and they're going to be able to kind of pick up the pieces and be able to kind of control their own pathway when they play against quality opponents. Now, how they look in those games is truly going to be determined on how they take this film and make sure nothing of this ever is regrouped. They can't allow it to be burned into their brains and then become the new norm in Knoxville. And unfortunately for Tennessee fans, you know this feeling. You've seen this feeling. You've dealt with this for the last 20 years and even maybe a little bit longer. 1998 has been a long, long time. We're pushing nearly 3 decades since you had that moment. Since you had the ability to say you were on top of the college football landscape. It has been nearly 20 years since Philip Fulmer decided to go ahead and walk on out of the building in Knoxville. And Neyland still is popping. And Neyland still is one of the greatest locations in college football. And Neyland still has one of the best fan base, one of the best game days atmosphere, one of the best overall sites that you can see. But you still find a way to lose. And it's been that way for a while. After Lane Kiffin left in the middle of the night to go out to USC, after the Derek Dooley with the orange pants era, after what you saw with the Butch, we're not even going to bring up Butch Jones's name. I know that was a very dark time for you guys. Then you also got to talk about what happened with the Jeremy Pruitt situation. And now you feel like you got your guy in Josh Heupel. And it still feels like you just got kicked in the lower nether region because of, once again, you lose to a team that you thought you could beat. That's just it. I understand. But one game does not define your season. And if you don't believe me, go ahead and look at Alabama. Go ahead and look at how they've played. Beat up in the first half against Georgia, just lost to a team that had the longest losing streak to the Crimson Tide in their program history. The first time the Commodores have beaten the number 1 team in the country and have a top 5 win in the country. That's just kind of it. You're allowed to lose one. It sometimes happens. We are judging Connor Wigman based off how he looked against Notre Dame. Meanwhile, he's the reason why Texas A&M is sitting at 3-0 in conference play. You can't judge people simply based off of one game, but what you can do is learn from your mistakes. And what you also can do is if you're Arkansas, you can celebrate this like you just won the national championship because if this was a marquee win. And these are things that are very challenging to come by at programs to where you don't feel like things are going in your direction at any point. Yes, you see a little bit of traction, and then you see regression. And then you see a step in the right direction, and then you see regression. And then you see a step to where you feel like you got the right coach at the helm, and he's drinking a nice cold beer in the postgame, and people are excited, and they feel like that there's a certain sensibility. And then once again, here you are at 4-8 or 5-7. These wins aren't always common, but every once in a blue moon, you do see that matchup where it just feels like everything has to go your way. And it does. It does. That's what kind of happened for Arkansas tonight. When they needed a score, they got a score. When they want to be aggressive, they got aggressive. Tennessee found ways to shoot itself in the foot. Arkansas didn't. And for a quarterback that has shown you at times this year, Taylor Green, worth the price of admission to get into Razorback Stadium. When things are clicking, things are clicking. Bob Petrino was onto something when he decided to go out to Boise to go and bring him in as QB1 for what had to be kind of a throw it all out there, just accept whatever this season is. And he ended up being right against a top 5 team in college football. Taylor Green, also thanks to Malachi Singleton for picking up the pieces, but Taylor Green showed you what he was capable of. Maybe now we got to kind of put him in the same category as Diego Pavia. I'm not sure. Let's get to the comments section. Go ahead and leave your comments down below what you guys want to talk about. We're not going anywhere anytime soon. Tennessee wasn't tired. We double-teamed them and played offensive plays. Yeah, you had a great game. You did have a great game plan. No questions whatsoever about that, the slightest. DJ Khaled, another one, another upset. Told you. One of these weekends that was always going to be led with questions, concerns, certainly breakups, non-belief. You knew it was going to be a long weekend. Everyone knew it was going to be a long weekend. Ole Miss might be the best team in the SEC. At this point, who's stopping it? Kentucky may have just had one bad performance with the kryptonite being Shane Beamer. They could be in that conversation. Texas A&M sits that way right now, but Texas A&M might be the best team in the SEC. Certainly, there feels like there is a clear separation between good and great, and you're feeling it right now. Seems kind of scripted. Gumps losing to Vandy. UT bad Gumps. Everyone was going to drop one. Unfortunately, it just happened to be tonight in Fayetteville. Y'all thought Arkansas was an easy win. Now, I don't think anybody thought Arkansas was an easy win. I think many people thought that Arkansas would find a way to shoot itself in the foot. Imagine what happens when you don't end up pushing yourself behind the sticks. You don't have the self-inflicting wounds. You feel pretty good about the direction that your team is in because you're giving them the first punch. Saw trash offensively from Tennessee. Yeah, Gumps, I'm not going to lie to you, buddy. This was one of those game plans where it just felt like every single time that something good was happening, outside of Dylan Sampson running the football, especially in the second half, truly coming out of halftime to really set the tone, multiple missed bad plays. And it wasn't just Nico. It was drop balls. It was errant passing attacks. It was bad play calling. It wasn't a good overall performance when you think about it. Taylor did finish 19-27 for 2022. Yeah, he did. He had a very good game. Glad for that young man. I'm glad that we won a close one because there have been so many times walking off our field when their heads down. That's the thing. There are not many games that you're going to see where you are going to come away with a win. And that's our thing with Arkansas over the last pretty much decade or so, 2012, where you'll get one marquee win. You'll get one game where you'll figure things out. It just happened to be against a top 5 Tennessee team coming off a bye. Oklahoma put the blueprint out there to beat Tennessee. Arkansas took advantage of it. They did. They found a way to be able to take advantage of it. I don't know if they put the blueprint out there, but physical defense forced Nico to have to win through the air. But you also did see that ground game kind of take a little bit of pace. Not many people right now, I think, are paying attention to how good that ground game is with Dylan Sampson. Because I remember all offseason, all I heard was, how do you replace Jabari Small and Jalen Wright? How do you replace Jabari Small and Jalen Wright? I don't believe that we have a dude currently in our roster. And I'm sitting to myself saying, no, Dylan Sampson can be that guy. And just because if it's unproven doesn't mean it's not good. Sometimes we kind of get those words mixed up from time to time where we think that, oh, we haven't seen it, so automatically it's just terrible. That's not the case even in the slightest when it came to Tennessee. And it still isn't. I still think that their secondary is good. I still think that their defensive front is good. I still think that there is a lot to like about this team, especially on paper. And now because if you watch this, Tennessee loses, Ole Miss loses, Alabama loses, Georgia loses, everyone's lost a game. It kind of feels like it's a fair case. And again, it was a scary Saturday. People told you, don't be sleeping on this one. It's always the weekend that sneaks up on you. Snuck up on a lot of people, including Alabama, including Tennessee, and it nearly caught other programs throughout college football. I mean, think about it. For the first half, once again, you saw Ohio State struggle against an Iowa team. You watch as top 10 Michigan loses in the rematch that was Washington. You watch as right now, Miami's struggling on the road against Cal. Things happen that way. They do. It was against Florida last year too, so far for Tennessee this year. Yeah, again, that's just the case. It kind of feels that way, doesn't it? Just one game, randomly, kind of doesn't go in your way. T-Bag, I thought that was going to be the game that we had. What a shame. What a shame. Who I think is the top team in the country right now? I saw that question. Texas feels like it. Now, again, you kind of be lucky that they didn't have to play this weekend. You kind of have to feel lucky that they avoided the bye. LSU also avoided the bye at the right time. How they look next week in Red River Shootout. How they look next week when they have to take on Ole Miss at home. That's going to be really interesting. That's going to be kind of where we separate each other. That's kind of be where we figure out what those teams are. I'm going to be real. LSU has a loss. They can't afford to lose that many games. The good news is that currently, now that loss to USC, if they start winning out, it's not going to affect them. But they can't afford to lose that many games. It's impossible for them to. That's kind of it. T-Will for the game. T-Will for game MVP. T-Will called a perfect performance. Honestly, studying the tape, rebounding after what happened against Texas A&M, putting themselves in a good spot. Yeah, that defensive play calling was phenomenal once again. He did it 2 weeks ago when he was at Auburn. You saw the ability to capitalize, kind of take away the wide receivers, force Peyton Thorne and Hank Brown to win through the air. Didn't happen. Multiple turnovers, big physical goal line stop that was a fumble. Kind of the same thing again. Took away the rushing attack outside of a big few explosive plays from Dylan Sampson. Didn't allow Nico Iamaleava to attack through the air. Lot to like. Lot to like about it. LR is always 2 plays away from something. His excuses are getting old. Maybe. I don't know. I'm not going to go that far. Arkansas, we already talked about that one. Last one for you. Lots of flags on the play. Tennessee could tell they were rattled. Guys, again, some weekends, just the atmosphere of college football, atmosphere of a game day on the road, thinking that you feel better about yourself coming off a bye, or maybe you just feel like that you got right. It affects you. It does. It truly does. It affected Ole Miss. They didn't have to come off of a bye, but they did have basically a preseason to start their year. Struggle against a team like Kentucky. No offensive identity for 3.5 quarters. One drive was the difference about them really setting a tone and kind of just fumbling through 4 quarters of mediocrity. How about you talk about a Missouri team? They found a way to fumble the bag on the road, 2 weeks prepared for Texas A&M. Kind of sat there and said, we're going to go ahead and take on Marcel Reed. That didn't happen. Didn't happen in the slightest. No shot whatsoever. They had to play Connor Wigman. Alabama, coming off of a marquee win against Georgia. Doesn't look like Alabama of old. Does not look like the Alabama that we all knew for the last couple of years underneath Nick Saban. Even in the years where they weren't winning national championships, they aren't losing to a program like Vanderbilt. That's for dang sure. So everyone kind of gets one. You do. Not going to judge you based off one loss. Not going to say that your season's over because of one loss. You can turn the corner. And that's kind of it. This is one of those wake-up calls that good teams have. You're going to see pretty quickly who separates themselves in the SEC. You will. And it won't come next week for Missouri because they play UMass. I don't worry about that game. But 2 weeks from now, they play Auburn. Auburn had its best performance, and they'll be coming off a bye. They looked phenomenal at times. They didn't shoot themselves in the foot. They made a lot of miscues against a Georgia team that they probably shouldn't be hanging around with, but they did. They figured things out. That is exactly what you want to see. And then Arkansas, they're going to be a tricky out. No idea what to make of them moving forward. Seriously, no idea. They win this one. Momentum's at an all-time high. They're turning the corner. They feel a lot better. But also, how do you sustain this? How do you make sure that in a few weeks, you're not looking like Tennessee when you have to play against LSU? You're not looking like Tennessee when you have to play against Texas. You're not looking like Tennessee when you have to play against Ole Miss. Because if you don't do that, then guess what? You're in every game. If you do, you're right back to where you were square one. Tennessee's quarterback didn't pass for 100 yards. It's a mark until the late fourth quarter. You're right, he didn't. Great game plan. T. Will, again, dialing up coverages, making sure that his secondary was playing out of its mind. That was a performance to talk about. And I think that you kind of saw that at times when you went against Auburn. Think about that for a week. Think about that for a minute. Auburn basically had nowhere to go when they were mad at the line of scrimmage. Nowhere. Wide receivers could not get off of blocks. They had a blueprint on how to slow down really pass-heavy teams. And you didn't see it last week in the Southwest Classic because there was no separation. Now, also, what does that mean, of course, for what was A&M's offense? Was it more so just not things working with Marcel Reed, or was it just a bad performance from the wide receivers? And also, does that mean that Missouri secondary is piss poor awful? And so Arkansas might be able to capitalize against them to where their wide receivers also are struggling. And maybe that's a big deal because Missouri did not have a great performance with their wide receivers outside of a big touchdown pass to Theo Wiesene. That was really it. One major pass down the field. Can't really ask for more. Arkansas depends on the offensive line. It does. It's going to be a big deal. I think also having this bye is going to be beneficial for Taylor Green to get back to where he is. But there's a lot to like about it. I think that, again, Arkansas still controls its own destiny. But let's not kid ourselves. So does Tennessee. Tennessee can so easily go 11-1 and find their way into the college football playoff. Tennessee can still go 10-2 and find their way into the college football playoff. Tennessee can regroup, put this one behind them, never look at the tape again, basically burn it as soon as they arrive back at Rocky Top tonight, and just start fresh when they have to play Florida. Because the last thing that they can also afford to do is let this hinder in their brains. And then Florida, who, by the way, good, bad, or indifferent every single year, seems to make it a game of all games. They're 8-2 the last two times that they play Tennessee. That might eventually affect them. And now we're talking about Tennessee after losing to Arkansas, losing to Florida. Now they're waking up and they are now having a winner take all in what has to be the marquee win of all marquee wins in the third Saturday in October. And I can promise you this, you don't want to be going up against an Alabama squad when you're in a marquee must-win-all situation. Because the problem is that you're starting to think ahead after that game, and then you catch yourself slipping before you take on Georgia. That's not what you want to do. Not even a little bit. Great game plan, great execution by Arkansas. Absolutely a lot to clean up if you're Tennessee. A lot to like still if you're Arkansas. You know what the upside is for Tennessee. You know what the upside can be for Tennessee. You know what the overall persona is of Tennessee when things are humming. Just calling it like it is. Arkansas, they can be a spoiler. I made a video a few weeks ago talking about this Arkansas team, what direction they were going in, how I thought that win against Auburn might eventually catapult them into that conversation about being a slept-on 8-win roster. Guess what? They're right back in that conversation. They will be a challenging out if they don't find ways to shoot themselves in the foot. They did so against Texas A&M at times. Texas A&M got a hard-fought win. Nobody's going to take that away from them in the slightest. They found a way to win. But basically at that 1-yard line, Arkansas kind of just pushed them over. They found a way to shoot themselves in the foot against Oklahoma State in the second half. They did. But at the end of the day, they can still be that spoiler roster. And they got a couple more games on the schedule that might eventually take them out of the college football playoff. Seriously. Ole Miss, Texas, LSU. Just saying. Spoiler resides in Fayetteville. Take them to Hog City. Like, rate, review, subscribe. Make sure that you're following us on all the social channels, TikTok, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter. We will be back tomorrow morning. I got to get some sleep at some point today. Sunday fun day, recapping what was week 6. Hopefully you realize that just because the marquee games are not on the radar does not mean you will not see magic on a Saturday night, especially in what is the SEC. I'm Cole Thompson from SEC Unfiltered. Woo pig, Rocky Top, you'll be fine. Peace.